So in the last video, I talked about the difference between technological invention and social invention, and I made the argument that social invention was at least as important to progress as is technological invention. So now I want to ask a question about why it is that some social inventions like the Macarena, they are just fads, and other social inventions like the church or the state, these become huge and they become defining to a people. The argument I want to make is that the inventions that help a community to overcome the limit of progress at that time are the inventions that will become most important and most defining, because they will literally make a community more prosperous and make a community more powerful. And I've already mentioned that there's 4 economies. The 4th economy is something I'm predicting is going to occur as we see the repetition of a pattern of social invention and revolution. But in the past, we've had 3 economies. We've had the agricultural, we've had the industrial, and we've had the information economies. And those are actually defined by different limits. The agricultural economy is defined by the limit of land, natural resources. So if you want to get more prosperous in the very beginnings of a market economy, again, coming out of the Dark Ages, what you want to do is gain land. And there's a variety of things that are entailed in that. If you want the natural resources, of course, trade helps. So if you can establish trade routes with the Orient, or if you can discover new continents where you can bring in new products from the Americas, obviously that would help you to become prosperous and powerful. And there's technological inventions involved in that. Acquisition of land have to do with better shipping, better navigation, go from astrolabe to sextant, all these things that enable communities to better colonize, trade, conquer, explore. But meanwhile, back at home, if you will, in the West, in Europe, what we had was the invention of the nation state. This was the huge social invention that defined, if you will, the first economy from roughly 1300 to about 1700. We saw the emergence of a nation state to replace things like empire and city-states, and suddenly we had this new thing that depended on just a host of inventions, some social, some technological, some a hybrid. For instance, if you want to protect land and expand it, standing army would be a big and important part of that. Well, standing army involves lots of things. You can invent cannon, where you can take the technology you had from church bells into cannons. Now you don't need knights. If you get a pistol, you don't need knights. You can just arm children, in fact. And that's where the French word infantry comes from, as children that you can use as the army for conquering and defending borders. This makes you richer. So a nation state becomes very important, and it replaces the medieval Dark Ages kind of thing we have, where kingdoms are based on a person, and when there's a shift in power, then actually borders will shift. And the great saying that we hear from the French kingdom, the king is dead, long live the king, what that really is a triumph of is the institution over the individual, where now we've got a lasting nation state that outlasts any particular king. But the social inventions there are myriad. In order to get a standing army, you need revenues. To get the revenues, you need taxation. To get the taxation, you need bureaucracy. To get the bureaucracy, you need a legal code. You need courts, which actually came out of the king's courts. They're just a host of inventions, and the faster the better you're able to invent these things, the more rapidly you have access to and power over land, and the more power you have. Then the second economy, this is not based on land so much as, well, now we've discovered the world, the land that we have is there. Now the next thing is, what do you do with this land? What do you do with the natural resources? And of course, what we know now in hindsight is obvious, is that you process these. You process them into higher value products. You take raw cotton and you turn it into clothing, garments, fashion. You take iron ore and you turn it into machines. And so capital becomes a limit in the second economy. Instead of land, we now have capital, and both financial and industrial capital. What are the inventions here? Well, in social inventions, we have everything from bookkeeping to shares to factories and how you organize people, and of course you have things like steam engines and how you process materials. But then we come into the third economy, roughly 1900, because what happens? Communities have overcome the limit of capital. Now, that's a gross generalization, but what I'm trying to say is that at a certain point you can make more goods than you can sell. You're no longer limited by your ability to manipulate raw materials into finished product through the use of factories and capital, machinery, financing, all of that. What you're now limited by is your ability to understand and manipulate markets. And in order to do that, in order to better design a product that will be able to sell, to design a process that will be efficient and keep your costs down, to even design a market through things like advertising, branding, marketing, all these things require the manipulation of symbols. And this brings us into the information economy. And now what limits us is not capital, but knowledge workers, people who are able to understand stress and engineering kind of design principles, people who are able to understand advertising and marketing principles and what it is that makes people come to stores and buy things. We see the establishment of brands in the late 1800s into the early 1900s. We see the invention of Santa Claus, someone who just conveniently shows up a week before year-end inventory, encouraging people to buy gifts for each other and get product out of the store. So all these things that are invented then to shift us from the limit being capital to now the limit being knowledge work. And epitome of the kind of firms that prosper, there are firms like an IBM where the one word motto is think. But part of what happened too is we get the rise of the corporation and the government. Both of these entities become larger and bigger for the simple reason that knowledge workers are specialists. If you have a guy who can design a beautiful house, but he has no crew to build the house, his value is zilch. A specialist has value only as part of a team, and these organizations emerge, whether in government, public sector, or private, corporate sector. These organizations emerge to coordinate the efforts of these people, and the invisible hand of the market gets replaced by the visible hand of management. So that takes us up to where we are today. And I would argue that one of the many reasons that you can argue that we're coming into a fourth economy, an entrepreneurial economy, where our limit isn't land or natural resources, our limit isn't capital, financial or industrial, and our limit isn't knowledge workers. It is instead entrepreneurship, the ability to combine land, labor, and capital, to bring all these things together to create a product that has value, to create a sustainable organization that has value. One of the many reasons you can argue we've hit that point is we're already seeing things in the developed world where even with high rates of education, we're still seeing high rates of unemployment. We're not able to create the jobs. We're not limited. It's not enough to just put money and to put educated people out into the market and see corporations just suck those into roles that they need and increase productivity, increase output. Now, what we need to do is look at the limits to the self. And entrepreneurship, what that ultimately suggests is it's not the land, labor, or capital. It is what the individual is able to do. Archimedes said, give me a lever long enough and I can move the world. Now, he also would need, of course, a place to stand. And I would argue that the self is that place to stand. What we see through history is individuals having a clear sense of who they are and what it means to be human and taking on the huge institutions of the time. Martin Luther declares, we are all priests. And in that, he starts this Protestant revolution where he shifts power from Pope to the people. And it's something we see to this day, the continual de-evolution of power, the dispersal of power out to more and more people. Thomas Jefferson writes, all men are created equal. And again, we see this dispersal of power from monarchs to the people. Jefferson, Martin Luther, they have this clear sense of what it means to be human and what that suggests about how they're going to transform the institutions. They didn't get their definition of who they were from the institution. Rather, as social inventors, social entrepreneurs, they actually reinvented the institution based on the notion of who they were. More recently, what we've seen in the last century is this transformation of the bank. And what that means is everything in the private sector, things like credit cards and mutual funds that give individuals more access to investment and credit markets that previously only the rich and the elites had, and now this is spread out. In the public sector, things like Social Security, which give the individual, give the masses access to retirement in ways that they never had before. Again and again, what we see through all these major changes and bits of progress is that the individual defines these institutions. But again, social invention, entrepreneurship has been something that's not been popularized, but instead it's just comes from outside the system. It's not expected. So if we go back to the previous video I've made, and the point there about arguing that what happened in the last century was we institutionalized technological invention, and this century we're going to institutionalize social invention, one of the steps there is we're going to have an increasing number of people become more entrepreneurial, but it also means that these people have to have a clear sense of self from which they can define what it means for them to have a different kind of religion, a different kind of government, a different kind of school, a different kind of corporation. Limit of the fourth economy is entrepreneurship. It's our ability to think in systems and bring all these pieces together, but more fundamentally, it's a limit of imagination for people to think outside the boxes they've grown up within to create something new and different. And this, to me, it seems, is one of the most exciting promises of the fourth economy.